Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to the University of Glasgow. My name is Anton Muscatelli. I'm the principal of the university, and it's my very great pleasure to give you a very warm welcome on a very cold night. And can I, on your behalf, particularly welcome, of course, Professor Hutter back to Glasgow, and Rebecca, his granddaughter, who is accompanying him on his journey north this evening. We're delighted to see you both, and you're very welcome. Before I introduce Otto to you, let me say just a few words about the lecture series, the Holocaust Memorial Lecture Series, and the people and organizations who have made this such a successful and important annual event here in Glasgow. The university's first Holocaust Memorial Lecture took place in 2001. It was originally organized by Professor Bernard Wasserstein and, of course, by our speaker tonight, Professor Hutter. The first lecture featured Professor Serene Kershaw of Sheffield University speaking on genocide, religion, and modernity. And since then, we've been fortunate in attracting a range of distinguished speakers who have spoken on an extraordinarily broad set of topics related to the Holocaust. The lecture, as for tonight's lecture, always attracts great numbers, and it's fantastic to see you all here, and thank you all for turning up in such numbers. The quality, the longevity and success of this annual lecture series has been made possible in part by generous financial support from the Association of Jewish Refugees, several of whom are represented here tonight, and indeed Professor Hutter himself. Since 2007, speakers have been chosen by a committee chaired by Professor Ray Stokes, and this includes academics from this university, as well as a representative of the AJR. And I'd like to thank them all for supporting the series over the years and indeed for making this evening possible. So it's now my very great pleasure to introduce our very special guest speaker for tonight. Otto Hutter was initially educated in Vienna before his evacuation to England under the Kindertransport of 1938. After graduating with a BSc and PhD from University College London, Otto remained there for several years, working as a researcher and then as a lecturer in the Department of Physiology. He subsequently joined the National Institute for Medical Research for a period of 10 years before coming to Glasgow in 1971 as Regius Professor of Physiology, a post he held with great distinction for 19 years. It is, of course, his experience and that of his fellow classmates of the Kindertransport and its aftermath which Otto has preserved, and that forms, of course, the focus for tonight's lecture. I'm sure that you're greatly looking forward to hearing and reflecting on not just the story of these events, but the very direct and indeed very compelling words and voice of lived experience. Otto, it's a great pleasure and it's a real privilege to have you back in Glasgow. We thank you greatly, and we can't thank you enough, in fact, for making the effort to be here. Though I suspect that same passion and sense of purpose which helped establish this Holocaust series still burns as bright today as it ever did. So with that in mind, I won't delay you any further. I would invite you now, Otto, to give the 18th Holocaust lecture entitled Exodus from Vienna.
Thank you, Sir Anton, for these kind words. It's great to be back here in Glasgow under familiar surroundings and many familiar faces. But I have never lectured, of course, in this new theatre before. What I do remember is that Charles Wilson was the principal who hired me. He advised me to run the department with a light hand. I suppose that is how he ran the university. He could afford to do so because he had behind him a wonderful team of administrators. There was Dr. Hutchison, the Secretary of Court, Mr. Bradley, his Assistant Secretary, and the Finance Officer. And behind them, they had teams of mostly grey-haired ladies who knew where every file was kept. Not a computer in sight, not even an electric typewriter, because Dr. Hutchison objected to the extraordinary, exorbitant cost of the electric typewriter ribbons. But there was enough money to refurbish and modernize the all-important physiology practical classes And that is what I started off to do. But hey, will somebody please stop me? I'm giving the wrong lecture. I'm not meant to be talking about Glasgow in the 1970s, but about Vienna earlier on in the 1930s. And indeed, it is now close on exactly 80 years ago that Hitler marched into a jubilant Austria. Nearly 80 years since my father of blessed memory, Zichrono Livracha, explained to me, I was then a 14-year-old boy, since he explained to me how terrible it was that we were now deprived of the rights of citizenship and of the protection by the law. And indeed, as soon as the Nazis were in power, the Viennese mob vented its anti-Semitic spleen without restraint by the police. Whilst the police looked on, Nazi louds subjected Jewish men to brutalities and indignities. Can we have the first slide? Here you see Jewish men forced to scrub the pavement clean of the Ja slogan, which was written on them in preparation to the Austrian independence plebiscite, which actually was never held. This photo appeared in the British press at the time, and you can see the police looking on. But not only adults were subjected to ill usage and much more. Jewish school children were also maltreated in the state schools. The Jewish children were segregated to the back of the classrooms, and not a few teachers turned up with Hakenkreuz armbands, revealing their allegiance. And Nazi-inspired so-called Aryan pupils were encouraged to turn into tormentors of their Jewish classmates. And then on April the 29th, 1938, a little more than a month after the Anschluss, Jewish secondary pupils were expelled overnight from a broad range of state schools and herded into a few ghetto schools, often right across the city from where they lived. But by great good fortune, I myself remained untouched by this outburst of Viennese anti-Semitism. You see, my parents had enrolled me wisely already in 1934 into the one and only Jewish grammar school in Vienna. And thanks to much coaching by my elder and cleverer sister Rita, I actually passed the entrance examination. So in the spring of 1938, whilst Jewish students in state schools were being traumatized, my school protected me from any harm. So let me tell you a little about the school and its teachers before I go on to the main topic of my talk, which is to relate what life had in store for the class of 14-year-old boys and girls to which I belonged. The school was founded soon after the First World War by the then chief rabbi of Vienna, Chaim Peretz Chayes. Here he is. Chayes was a visionary man with modern ideas and strongly influenced by Zionism. Zionism had then just gained the support of the British government in the Balfour Declaration of November 1917. And you will remember that just a couple of months ago, we celebrated the centenary of the Balfour Declaration. From the onset, therefore, in the school, the teaching of modern Hebrew was a defining feature. As headmaster, Chayes appointed Dr. Victor Kellner. Here he is later in life. Before receiving the call to Vienna, Kellner had been a master at the Herzliya Gymnasium in Tel Aviv. Interestingly, when Tel Aviv was founded in the sand dunes in 1906, in the sand dunes north of Jaffa, the Herzliya Gymnasium was the first public building to be erected, and the modern school literally grew up the modern town literally grew up around the school. So Kellner had plenty of pioneering experience, and he needed it all when he came to Vienna. For after World War I, Vienna was a much impoverished capital, a capital that had lost its empire. So Kellner had to struggle to raise funds and to find premises for the new school. But the most important ingredient for success, namely teachers of high quality, was in good supply. For post-war Vienna had a surfeit of Jewish intellectuals, PhDs in all subjects, many of them worthy of university appointments, but left out in the cold because Austrian universities were a hotbed of anti-Semitism. So Kellner managed to recruit great teachers who stayed devotedly with the school, despite the fact that often they were paid late. Next slide, please. This is the building in the Castelletzgasse which housed the school when I first entered it. Now it houses luxury flats, but a memorial plate by the side of the portal records the history of the school, of the building as a Jewish school, and sadly also that this building was used as an assembly point for Jews prior to their deportation to concentration camps between 1942 and 1944. Next slide shows you my class. As you can see, we were a co-educational school. For a Jewish school, that would be regarded as modern even today. Also, the leveling concept of school uniform was unknown in Vienna and probably still is. This class photo was taken in June 1938. By then, my class had been enlarged to 41 pupils because several pupils from state schools had been admitted by mid-session. To save you guessing, I haven't got a pointer. Oh yes, this little fellow here, that little is me. Also shown are two masters. Professor Rabinovich in the second row here. Professor Rabinovich taught physics and mathematics, and like all physics and mathematics teachers, they are worth their weight in gold. So he soon found employment abroad when the pressure on Jewish emigration became hard in the summer of 1938. The second teacher pictured there is Professor Victor Löwenfeld, who was our class master. Vicky, as he was affectionately known, taught art. He had written a book in which he described how the artwork of children develops with their aesthetic, intellectual, and emotional growth. Unbeknown to us, we were the guinea pigs for that book. And on the strength of it and more, Löwenfeld eventually became professor of art education at Philadelphia University in the States. our Latin master, not pictured here, was Professor Gabe. He contrived to take us through Caesar's the Bello Gallico whilst remaining our interest. And he took up an appointment as professor of moral philosophy at Caracas University in Venezuela. Little did we know how much overqualified he was to teach us. We were taught English by a good-looking young woman called Hannah Gardler. She had just then returned from a 6-month study leave in England to perfect her English pronunciation. And in the first lesson, she asked us just to listen and then to repeat. Jack and Jill went up the hill to fetch a pail of water. So from her, we learned English like a child learns English from its mother. But alas, for some of us, like me, it was too late to be imprinted by Hannah Adler's perfect English pronunciation. And as you can see, I have still retained a Central European accent. Now, after this detour about some of our teachers, let me tell you what life had in store for the 40-odd classmates. By the end of the school year in June 1938, a few well-placed families had already laid plans to leave Vienna or to send their children to relations abroad. So this was a time for parting. And as a normal teenager, I was attached to my school friends. So I drew up a list of their names and addresses, both in Vienna and some of those who had already emigrated. Here is the original of that list, which I've kept by me these last 80 years. Now, lost my point. Right. Now, at the time, I promised myself to keep in touch with my classmates. However, events moved too quickly, and fully 60 years passed before I started to inquire into what happened to my mates. I was retired by then and looking for a hobby, when by chance I got hold of a newsletter circularized by an American alumnus of the Gymnasium. Although he was a few years older than I, he mentioned a couple of my classmates, and from that beginning, I pieced together the biographies of almost all my classmates through networking and through searching sources. And I've persuaded myself that the picture which emerged might perhaps be regarded as a piece of micro-historical research, microhistory being the history of ordinary people caught up in world-shaking events. So, returning to June 1938, appallingly, most countries had by then shut the doors to Jewish refugees. Especially sadly, Britain had broken faith with the Balfour Declaration and with the League of Nations mandate based upon it. And it had curtailed Jewish immigration into Palestine into a trickle, just when a national home providing a safe haven for Jewish refugees was most urgently needed. But, as so often happens, exemptions were available for those rich enough. Anyone who could stump up £5,000, that is about £100,000 in today's money, Anybody who could stump up that much money could qualify for a capitalist immigration certificate. And there were just a few in my class, a few families that had managed to preserve enough wealth through the Great Depression of the 1930s to qualify so. My best friend was Michael Plaskes. His father was a lawyer who had wisely invested in newly built property in Tel Aviv already in the early 1930s. He promptly packed up his family, took it to Palestine, and Michael finished schooling there. He then joined the local police, and as a keen sailor himself, he eventually became chief of Tel Aviv Harbor Police Force. Sadly, he died of liver cancer while still in his 40s. Max Weinreb was one of the pupils who joined the class after the Anschluss. His family had owned a country estate from which they were, of course, promptly evicted. Even so, they could still afford a capitalist immigration certificate. And later, his parents sent Max to Beirut to study dentistry at the American University there. Eventually, Max became the founding professor of Tel Aviv Dental School. The parents of another boy, Joseph Glassberg, also qualified for a capitalist certificate. Joseph continued his education at Mikveh Israel Agricultural College. That college was famous for the research done to improve agriculture in arid climates. Then in 1948, when the newly established state of Israel was attacked by the armies of the surrounding Arab states, Joseph, like the rest of the students, joined the Israel Defense Forces. But as a man of great stature, Joseph opted to become a professional soldier, and he stayed on to fight again in the 1967 Six-Day War and then in the 1973 Yom Kippur War. Eventually, he rose to the rank of Major General, a high rank in the numerically small professional Israeli army. One of the brightest and most idealistic boys of my class was, next slide please, was Alfred or Ephraim Elster. He also reached Palestine early, I think thanks to his family being allotted one of the few ordinary certificates awarded to people who were long-standing applicants to join a kibbutz, one of the cooperative agricultural settlements. In 1948, during Israel's defensive war, Ephraim refused officer training so as to remain in the midst of battle. Sadly, he was killed in action in western Galilee in 1948. What needs to be recalled here is that although the Arab armies failed in their intention to utterly destroy the newborn Jewish state, they did inflict heavy casualties. Out of a population at the time of only about 600,000, total Israeli fatal casualties amounted to 6,373. In percentage terms, this is equivalent to rather more than the total British military and civilian fatal casualties in all theaters of war during World War II. Another classmate who reached Palestine still during 1938 was Yossi Friedlander. His family settled in Haifa, and Yossi was enrolled into the newly founded nautical school in that harbor city. As a result, Yossi served in the Royal Navy during the war. He served as an engineer in the naval yard in Alexandria, and so confined to solid ground, to terra firma. He told me that during the war the Navy did not trust Jewish sailors to join the fleet on water. After the war, Yossi made his career in the Israel textile industry in one of the first enterprises which changed the Israeli economy from agriculture to manufacturing. Nowadays, of course, information technology drives the Israel economy. Now, the deceased father of another boy, Bertolt Feinstein, had been a leader of a Zionist movement, and as a reward for his father's services, his widowed mother received one of the few precious regular immigration certificates. Once in Israel, Bertolt Hebraized his name to Ben Zion, and he also went to Mikveh Israel Agricultural College. Incidentally, Mikveh Israel means the hope of Israel, and it is a moniker which has been coined by the prophet Jeremiah. In 1945, Ben Zion and his young wife Hannah were founding members of the kibbutz Lehavot HaBashan in the Hule Valley north of the Sea of Galilee. Here's the Sea of Galilee, around this little, go north, bit Lake Hule, can you see? Little up. No, there we are. There. That area in 1945 was swampland, infested by mosquitoes. When I visited there about 20 years ago, it was a beautiful wooded village with a stream meandering through it, feeding a series of productive fish ponds. I was also shown around the kibbutz's industrial enterprise, a factory producing fire extinguishers, both for home use and for export. Happily, both Yossi and Ben Zion are still alive. Yossi, now a widower, lives in a rest home in Haifa. Ben Zion and Hannah are well cared for in the kibbutz's splendid nursing home, still lovingly surrounded by their children and grandchildren living in the kibbutz. That is the just reward for a lifetime of pioneering effort. Now, allow me to take a short detour to the Lake of Galilee. When I first saw it, it looked like all over like a Scottish loch, surrounded on the on the west by the hills of Ephraim, and on the east by the Golan Heights. Moreover, in Tiberias, at the shore of the lake, the Scottish saltire flies proudly from the tower of St. Andrew's Church. And I believe the Church of Scotland runs a tourist hostel in Tiberias. So if you ever decide to take a holiday in Tiberias, preferably in the winter, you will feel perfectly at home. And you will be able to hire a boat and try your luck fishing on the Sea of Galilee as Andrew and Peter, the apostles, did. Well, now back to 1938-39. So far, I've told you about 6 boys from my class who have made Palestine so far. In addition, one girl, Leah Kalman, Leah K., also made it. I remember her because of her flaming red hair. Although she was still only 15 at the time, she pretended to be already 16 in order to squeeze into the last youth aliyah group to leave Vienna. I should explain that Youth Aliyah was a movement to transfer unaccompanied youngsters over 16 to Palestine and train them in various trades. Leah, living in a crowded hostel in Tel Aviv, was taught dressmaking. And she has told me that out of the other 59 girls in the hostel, only 2 ever saw their parents again. Happily, Leah married well, and when I last saw her, now as a widow, she lived in a model sheltered housing development in Jerusalem. So altogether, 7 of my classmates reached Palestine before the outbreak of war, despite the severe restrictions on Jewish immigration imposed at the time. A few of my classmates had relations in England, and they also left early. Heinrich Eigenmacht went to an uncle who sent Heinrich to board at Clifton College in Bristol. What happened to him later, I don't know for sure, but a 15-year-old boy from Vienna, whose particulars matched those of Heinrich, embarked on SS Newfoundland when she sailed from Liverpool to Boston in April 1940. And the ship manifest states that he possessed the requisite $50 and was on his way to his brother in Washington. Salo Bohorocana also had an uncle in London who took him in. Salo had Czechoslovak nationality, and later during the war he served in the Czechoslovak army. After the war he became a businessman in London. He leads a strictly Orthodox life, and when I last heard of him now some years ago, he had 27 grandchildren. Another strictly Orthodox boy, Kurt Juris, was accepted by Yeshiva, a rabbinical college in Stoke Newington. I did not have the right contact to trace him further. The prettiest girl in the class, Gertrude Goldstoff, was taken in by an uncle who had a medical practice in London. Later, when she was evacuated into the country and left to her own resources, she fell for a sailor and married him on the spot. Now, to keep count, tally, next slide please. We have so far dealt with, can't quite count it up, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, is it? 10 of my schoolmates who managed to leave early on after Hitler's takeover. Then, in November 1938, came Kristallnacht, the firebrand pogrom staged throughout the German Reich, but with special brutality in Vienna. It was the curtain raiser of the Holocaust. And remarkably, within a month, the Kindertransports to Great Britain were organized. So in December 1938, 6 boys in my class, including myself, were fortunate enough to come to Britain by Kindertransport. Paul Hyman was the scion of a musical family. His grandfather directed the choir at the Vienna State Opera. His father was choir master at Vienna's Seitenstättengasse Temple, the home of much modern synagogue music. Paul himself played the accordion, and while still living in a hostel in London during the war, he organized a dance band which performed on the popular BBC Listen as You Work, Music as You Work program. After the war, Paul emigrated to Canada to join a friend in the timber business. One snowy evening outside Toronto, he gave a lift to a young woman who had missed the last bus. Her name was Trudy, and it turned out that she also hailed from Vienna. 3 weeks later, they were married, and they lived happily for many years. Paul and I still exchange greetings. The parents of another boy, Moshe Aberbach, were both Hebrew teachers. So Moshe was fluent in Hebrew even before he entered the Chayes Gymnasium. On arrival in Britain, Moshe chose to go to an Orthodox hostel in Leeds. And for a while, he worked as an apprentice trouser presser in Montague Burton's factory in Leeds. But through evening classes, he soon gained matriculation to Leeds University. And in 1944, he gained a first-class degree in history and another first-class degree in Hebrew, just as the icing on top of the cake. Later, during a stint of 30 years as professor of Jewish history at Baltimore Hebrew College in the States, Moshe published many fine books, both in Hebrew and in English. He retired to Jerusalem, and we met there whenever I visited Israel. I owe to Moshe many leads to the fate of our common classmates. Sadly, Moshe is no longer alive. Hugo Brummer, another boy, was with a group of Habonim, a Zionist youth movement that joined the Kindertransport. They went to a farm at Whittingham Farm School, which had been established on Lord Balfour's estate outside Edinburgh. That led to further agricultural training at a farm near Newport Pagnell in preparation for cultivating Palestine. Throughout, Hugo stood out for his organizing talent. And in 1944, he was transferred to Habonim headquarters in London. In 1947, he succeeded to enter Palestine illegally by pretending to be a returning resident. And with the establishment of the State of Israel, Hugo was recruited into the Israeli diplomatic service, and eventually he became Israeli ambassador to Zaire and other African countries. In retirement, Hugo and his wife lived in a modest flat in Jerusalem on a modest pension. When I visited him there, I told him that were he a retired ambassador in Britain, he would by now be Sir Hugo. But it takes all kinds to make a world. To wit, another Hugo from my class, Hugo Breinin, joined Free Austria during the war, during his stay in London. Free Austria was a left-wing refugee movement. And after the war, Hugo considered it his mission to restore socialism to Austria. He returned to Vienna, the only one of our class to do so. He married a girl who had survived Auschwitz, and they still live in Vienna, albeit now in poor health. I dare say that he is a bit disappointed to see the right-wing Freiheitliche Partei Österreich, the Austrian Freedom Party, now as part of the government. Now, after the first Kindertransport, each child had to have a British sponsor. My classmate Freddie Harman was lucky to be sponsored by a family who sent him to a boarding school in Kent. Although Freddie had not been an outstanding pupil in our class, he exceeded in his new school. Indeed, he so impressed his headmaster that when the school lost teachers through military call-up, Freddie was made assistant master in the prep school, although he was then only 16. Later on in his career, Freddie became head of a London City College. Sadly, he also died relatively young of liver cancer. That leaves Otto H. He was exceptionally lucky. His father, in his letters, had urged him to seek continued schooling. So Otto refused opportunities to become a tailor's or even a jeweler's apprentice. Instead, he kept on saying, "I want to continue to go to school." Eventually, he was selected for a place at Bishop Stortford College in Hertfordshire. The old boys of that school had collected funds with quite wonderful, unmatched compassion and generosity, funds to educate 2 refugee boys. So Otto benefited from a fine education to the age of 18. In 1942, he then became a laboratory technician at the Wellcome Physiological Research Laboratories in Beckenham, Kent, which was engaged in essential war work. I'm not sure what happened to him afterwards, but rumor has it that he was seen in later years tending a garden on the Isle of Bute, one of the islands in the Clyde estuary. Now, in the terrible years when Jews were hounded out of Germany and Austria, the United States conducted an extremely restrictive immigration policy. Even prospective immigrants with affidavits had to wait long before being admitted to the quota. My classmate Norbert Hauser and his parents were amongst the lucky ones. Once in America, he was sent to the local high school. Doing well, he was selected to enter the US Army Engineering College. And in 1944, when his unit was in France, Norbert, with only 2 other GIs, was set the task to disarm 100 German prisoners, a scary task. He persuaded them to lay down their arms by addressing them in German and telling them how lucky they were because they would soon be fed American rations and be looked after, whereas he, poor devil, would have to carry on soldiering. When this bravura performance reached headquarters, Norbert was appointed to public relations. Returning to civil life, Norbert eventually became a professor of engineering. Remarkably, Germany allowed Jews to emigrate to America even after the outbreak of war in Europe, because America remained neutral for so long. 2 boys who made it so late were Louis Dauber and Leonard Ehrlich. The aunt in Brooklyn who took in Louis was herself impoverished, and she sent him to the local school the day after he disembarked. Just imagine the culture shock. When Louis turned 16, he had to earn his keep by assembling fountain pens until he joined up as a GI at the age of 18. After the war, Louis, now a veteran GI, was finally enabled to continue his education. He became a chemical engineer, an intellectually demanding profession, but no headache for Louis, who had always been at the top of the class. By contrast, Leonard had not been such a bright pupil. In fact, he failed Latin. Nicht genügend, not adequate, was his dreaded mark, and our mercilessly strict headmaster held him back for a year. Nevertheless, Leonard became a much-published, distinguished professor of philosophy in a prestigious American university. He and his wife Edith also a pupil at the Holocaust Gymnasium. The two were childhood sweethearts who met again in America. Leonard and Edith spent their last years writing a monumental book that deals with one of the most problematic questions about the Holocaust, namely how Jewish leaders, especially those in Vienna and Theresienstadt, reacted when faced with agonizing Nazi demands. Here is an extract. Here's an extract from a letter sent to me some years ago. I have the text here. Edith and I tried to put the finishing touches on Choices under Direct, the title of the book. We pushed the most unpleasant part to the end, the deportations, the end of the community. And at last it is done. It was harrowing, believe me. Ever so often we had to leave the work for 2 days, taking sleeping pills until we had a night without vivid dreams. As of now, that book has 1,000 closely printed pages. Sadly, Leonard and Edith did not live long enough to see the book published. But I have recently heard from their son, Karl Ehrlich, who himself is a professor in Canada, that the first volume of the book is due to appear later this spring, and I'm sure it will cause much debate, will stir much debate. Next slide, please. South America was another destination for some of my classmates. Blanca Dhaba was one of 3 sisters, all of them at the Holocaust Gymnasium. The family escaped first to Switzerland and hence to Bolivia and then to the Argentine, all with false visas obtained at great cost. In the Argentine, Blanca capitalized on her linguistic skills, and she qualified as a publicly accredited translator from German or from English or French into Spanish. After the war, Blanca immigrated to Israel, married, and raised a family. My classmate Kurt Ginsberg and his family reached Ecuador. Ecuador, there we are, yeah. Reached in 1939, Ecuador lacked all industry. So Kurt's father, who had some industrial experience, started to manufacture paper bags. Paper bags being a commodity that is in demand even in a purely agricultural economy. Kurt refused to go to the Jesuit seminary that was the only high school in Quito. Instead, Kurt worked in his father's rudimentary factory. At the age of 17, his father sent him to New York to buy machinery. By the time Kurt was 27, he was in charge of an industrial empire that had grown out of the initial humble enterprise. Later on, Kurt took his teenage twin daughters to Israel so that they might find husband. But Kurt was not fortunate enough to see a growing family. He had been a heavy smoker, and he died of emphysema in his 30s. Worth noting is that Kurt's family were not alone in bringing industrial expertise to Ecuador. Other Jewish refugees from Germany and Austria also ventured that far into the unknown because, quite exceptionally, Ecuador had not closed its doors to refugees. And laudably, Ecuador had the good grace a few years ago to celebrate the arrival of these refugees and their contribution to the development of the country. Another Kurt in our class, Kurt Geiger and his camp family, escaped to an even more exotic destination. Kurt Geiger's father was a musical conductor who obtained a post as a bandmaster with a Maharaja, so he took his family to India. There, Kurt unfortunately contracted transverse myelitis, which crippled his legs for life. Nevertheless, he lived out a full life in America thanks to being a gifted violinist. One of the girls in my class, Sally Alter, was more unfortunate. She was an only daughter who refused to leave her parents when she was given the chance to leave by Kindertransport. In the summer of 1939, the family managed to smuggle themselves into Belgium. And just before the outbreak of war, they boarded an overcrowded ship bound for Cuba. When typhoid broke out on board, Sally nursed the sick. But in the end, she succumbed herself and she died shortly after the ship docked in Havana. Sally was a victim of the Holocaust as much as anyone, but you will not find her counted amongst the 62,000 Jewish Holocaust victims from Vienna. Nor will you find the name of Berta Körner, another girl in my class. She also escaped to Belgium before war broke out, but sad to say, she was later rounded up and deported to her death. Belgium was also the first destination of Harry Stein. Happily, his is a more felicitous story. In 1940, when Germany invaded France, he and his mother managed to keep just one step ahead of the German army and to reach Vichy France. There, Harry quickly picked up French, resumed schooling, and within a year passed the baccalaureate with distinction. Being a handsome and personable fellow, Harry made many friends amongst French boys and amongst French girls. When later the Vichy government started to round up Jews, Harry was thrown into a detention camp. He was about to be transported east when his school friend Jacqueline, who was the niece of a high-ranking Vichy official, came to his rescue. On her own initiative, she called upon the commandant of the camp and told him, quite falsely, that Harry was her fiancé. So the commandant let Harry escape, and he made his way to the Italian Alps, joined a Jewish resistance group, and in 1945, he and his comrades set sail for Palestine. After the war, Harry visited France and searched for Jacqueline, but he couldn't find her. In Israel, he settled in Haifa, became an environmentalist, and working for the town administration, he was responsible for clearing Haifa Bay of the smog that had enveloped it as a result of industrialization. He also represented Israel at UNESCO. I now come to the final and darkest chapter of my search, to the two boys who never escaped from Vienna. About the first, Herbert Friedman, we know only little, only that his father had left for Shanghai, where the international concession was still open to anyone who came in the hope of bringing his family later on to China. But events intervened, and on the 11th November 1943, Herbert was amongst those assembled in the old Kreisgymnasium building prior to transportation to the Theresienstadt concentration camp. On the 29th September 1944, he and the other surviving prisoners in Theresienstadt were sent to their death in Auschwitz the next day. That would also have been my fate had I not gained the nearly last place on the Kindertransport by a truly miraculous coincidence. The second boy was Kurt Metzai. He survived in hiding. He survived in hiding in Vienna until April the 11th, 1945. By then, the Russians had already captured much of the town, but not yet the second district, the Leopoldstadt, where Kurt and 8 more of the few remaining Jews in Vienna were hiding in a cellar of Fostergasse 7. Somebody betrayed them to a retreating SS-Truppe, shouting, "Zeit genug, die Juden zu vernichten. We have just enough time to kill the Jews." The SS men herded their unfortunate victims one by one into a bomb crater outside the house and murdered them with gunshots and grenades. Then they filled in the crater roughly before making their hasty escape. When Kurt Metzai's body was exhumed 2 days later, it showed injuries from rifle butts and bayonets, as well as grenade wounds. The 9 victims of the last Nazi massacre in Vienna were reinterred in a common grave in Vienna's Jewish cemetery. Here I am, some years ago, paying homage to my classmate and good friend. Kurt was left behind in Vienna because his Hungarian father, Moros Metzai, who was a writer and playwright with socialist leanings, had to flee Vienna soon after the Anschluss, so for Italy as it happened. So Kurt lacked the parental assent which had to be secured for inclusion into the Kindertransport. Besides, Kurt's mother was a registrar for the Israelitische Kultusgemeinde, the empowered Jewish civic corporation, which the Nazis kept functioning in order to keep tabs on Vienna's Jewish population. And for some time, this afforded protection also to Kurt. Kurt kept a diary of which pages for the year 1941 have survived. That was the darkest year of the war, when Hitler's might extended over Europe at its peak. The entries into that diary give us glimpses into the compassionate soul of a proudly Jewish 17-year-old lad trapped in Vienna. For instance, when one girl from his small circle of friends was commandeered to forced labor in Germany, he sent her repeatedly envelopes filled with just 2 ounces of dried vegetables to supplement her meager diet. And when Jews were forced to wear the yellow star, as from the 19th of September, he records in his diary, partly sardonically, partly proudly, here is a translation, große Premiere der Judensterne. Der Judenstern stört mich gar nicht, im Gegenteil, ich trage ihn mit Stolz. Great premiere of the Jewish stars. The Jewish star does not worry me in the least. On the contrary, I wear it with pride. Kurt also composed a deeply moving problem, probably in 1941, after witnessing the deportation of 1,000 Jews. I have the poem here. German poetry does not translate too well, but I see here quite a few people who know their German still, so we'll read it out. Judenschicksal. Ich sah heut 1000 Menschen verstörten Angesichts. Ich sah heut 1000 Juden, die wanderten in nichts. Im Grau des kalten Morgens zog die verfärmte Schar, und hinter ihr verblasste, was einst ihr Leben war. Sie schritten durch die Pforte und wussten nie zurück. Sie ließen alles dorten, Vermögen, Gleitung, Geltung, Glück. Wohin wird man euch führen? Wo endet eure Fahrt? Sie wissen nur das eine, ihr Ziel heißt der Stachelgrat. Und was dort ihren wartet, ist Elend, Qual und Not, Entbehrung, Hunger, Seuchen, vor viele bitterer Tod. Ich schaut in ihre Augen mit brüderlichem Blick, erwarten tiefste Jammer in solches Missgeschick. Doch statt Verzweiflung sah ich nur ungeheures Mühen, Haltung und Beherrschung aus ihren Augen glühen. Sah heißen Lebenswillen, sah Hoffnung und sah Mut. Ich sah in manchen Antlitz ein Lachen, stark und gut. Da habe ich tief ergriffen, den Geist des Volks erkannt, das aus Gewalt zu leiden, das Leiden noch stets bestand, das sich aus Not und Elend, Verbannung, Fröhn und Haft noch immer hat erhoben mit ungebrochener Kraft. Ich sah heut 1000 Menschen verstörten Angesichts und sah im Grauen des Morgen den Strahl des ewigen Lichts. And this was the work of a 17-year-old boy. Becky will translate it to you in English. My granddaughter, Becky Hutter. The English translation was made by a professional poet, William Barton.
Jewish destiny. 1,000 human faces contorted in distress. I saw today 1,000 Jews walking into the abyss. Leaving the traces, the banished crowd moved on under morning's shivering grey, leaving the traces of their lives to vanish silently. They passed beneath the gateway, knew they never would return. Their worldly goods they left behind, and fortune and good name. Where are you being taken? Where are you going to? Their journey's end is barbed wire. That's the only thing they know. And what awaits them there is but sickness, pain at best, is hunger, torment, sacrifice, for many death's bitter taste. I gazed into their eyes with a brother's heartfelt look, expecting deepest misery at fate's fell and dire stroke. But where despair should be, I saw instead enormous will shine from their eyes to bear upright and keep their self-control. And ardent will for life and hope and courage to endure, even some faces a smile, strong and pure. And then this people's spirit struck me, moved me deep. I saw that they were chosen for suffering, yet suffering always bore, always from hardship, misery, imprisonment and toil, they rose again with strength unbroken and with courage whole. In 1,000 human faces, I saw distress today, but in grey dawn saw rising lights, bright eternal ray.
Thank you, Becky. Thank you, Becky. Now, quickly to summarize, on the class list I drew up in June 1938, there are 39 names. Can I have the last slide, please? Of these, I have today reported on 29 listed up here. Of the remaining 10, I have some information about 9, enough to know through sightings and listings that they too managed to flee Vienna, but too little detail for inclusion today. Only about one girl, Blanca Rothfeld, have I drawn a complete blank. Let us hope that she also survived, married young, and so changed her name. If you add the 2 who came to Israel from South America in the 1915s, Israel eventually became the home of 13 of my classmates. So, not surprisingly, our largest reunion was held there. Here is the slide of 6 of us in 2009. This is Leah, the seamstress, Blanca, the linguist, Hugo, the diplomat, Joseph, the major general, Moshe Aberbach, the historian and Hebraist, and me. So thank you very much for your attention. Finally, want to acknowledge, this last slide please, acknowledge my indebtedness to Dr. David Miller, formerly reader of physiology here in Glasgow, who is now retired to Lymington in Langs, nearby to where we live, and who has kindly fixed the PowerPoint presentation for me. Thank you for your attention. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Otto has very kindly agreed to take a few questions. So if anyone wants to ask a question, if you put up your hand, a microphone will find you and you can then ask a question. So does anybody wish to ask any questions?
Just for background, my father left Vienna a few weeks before you did. I have always been puzzled by the juxtaposition of 2 facts that you mentioned. First of all, the fact of the Anschluss coming before the proposed referendum by a brief period, suggesting at the very least a lack of complete confidence on Hitler's part of its result. Second, though, what you described as the jubilation of the Austrian welcome of the German troops as they came over the border. Now, it is of course always possible that those who favored the Anschluss were on the streets jubilating, those who did not were invisible and behind closed doors and windows. But is that the fact? Why is there this apparent contradiction?
First, about the referendum, right? Now, Schuschnigg had hoped that perhaps the population might vote ja for continued Austrian independence. Hitler did not take the risk of waiting for the referendum, and he invaded Austria a day or 2 beforehand. I can't remember the exact date. Now, as regard his jubilant welcome, well, that was perfectly genuine. First of all, he entered Austria near his birthplace. I forget what the name is, in a province which was very much Nazi favored. And in Vienna, soon after he arrived, there was he spoke at the Heldenplatz to many 100,000 of Viennese who turned up. The Austrians were the best Nazis, better than the Germans. They made up lost ground within a few months. But when Germany persecuted the Jews gradually more and more over the years, the Austrians caught up within weeks on it with enthusiasm. I have no doubt whatsoever that it was. Of course, there were some good people. There always are, but they were very much in the minority. There's a book entitled by the German, "Zu wenige Gerechte." I forget the author of the word, but that is the title. Too few just people. That was the trouble of Austria. It may be still now.
Other questions? Yes.
Yes.
I burst in about 30 seconds before you started, and I'm so glad I made it here. It was an excellent talk. I found it incredibly moving and informative, so thank you very much for that. I have written a book called Hitler's Soldiers, which is a general history of the German army under the Nazis. And I didn't do a huge amount of research about the Anschluss and the role of the German army in that, but I did some. And I found some anecdotal evidence that some German army officers, regular army officers, did try to intervene against the outrages being committed against Jews in the weeks during and following the Anschluss. And I am quite cynical, and I think that there too is probably a case of zu wenige Gerechte. But would you care to comment on that? I don't know if you can, but have you done any research yourself? Have you looked into the role of the German army in Austria in those first weeks and months following the Anschluss and its attitude towards what was happening to the Jews?
Well, wait a moment. Who are you? Did you say you had written a book? Because are you from Strathclyde University?
No, I'm from Glasgow, Caledonia. My name is Ben Shepherd. Ben Shepherd is my name.
Yes, that's right. I have your book.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. Well, I've sold more than one. Be cynical.
I haven't read it yet.
Okay.
No. I know about you, and I thought it was wonderful work. But I did leave into it, you know. So I have to thank you, not you and me, for the wonderful research which you have done.
Thanks.
I don't really know about the German army's role in Austria. There was a story that the whole invasion could have been stopped by the Czech because the German army wasn't that proficient at that time, and the tanks didn't even roll that well, and so on. I don't know whether and if only it is a British government which did not resist the Anschluss. Yes. And Parliament was not to be moved to in any way oppose it. It could have been stopped. Hitler could have been stopped in 1938 by the Czechoslovaks. That's all I know. Now, the German army, there has been quite a lot of work recently, you know, from the newly discovered Soviet archives, that later on, when it came to the invasion of Russia, the German army had the killing program already well planned in advance. The idea that the German army was honorable, whereas the SS was to be blamed for everything is all nonsense. They were just as culpable
Yes.
as anybody else.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. Yeah.
And that I'm sure you agree with. You are the expert on these things, not I. You know.
No, I completely agree with all of that. By 1941, certainly the army was completely culpable, corrupted, etc. Yeah. There's an interesting question about how much, if any, was there a residue of decency left in 1938. I feel that even by then, the Nazification of the army was well underway. But it's an interesting question to see, how much old-fashioned decency was still there.
I can only tell you one thing about the Austrian army. As a boy, I used to play in the K Park along the Danube Canal. And every midday, a platoon and a band came from the Kaserne marching past the park. And we boys used to love marching with them to the Radetzky March. That's all I know about the army.
Thanks very much. Thanks.
I was quite fascinated by the story that you told and what happened to your classmates in the various parts of the world that they ended up. Significantly, and I know it's just a small sample, I noted that none of them went back to Austria or Vienna. And that intrigues me. I wonder how many of Jews at that time went back. There were a couple that I know in Glasgow who came here in 1938 as refugees. I'm just intrigued knowing...
Why did so few people go? Because of the horrible memories which we had, and the horrible treatment, and because also because of the wonderful welcome and opportunities for a new life which we found in the countries to which we emigrated to. I mean, there was for very few people there was any attraction. You had to be a very committed socialist, like Hugo Breinin was, to return to Austria in those days. And in Glasgow at the moment, in Bournemouth at the moment, a good friend of mine, Hertha, the Kammerling family, they also went to Austria at the same time, back to Austria. But they found anti-Semitism still so ingrained in Austria after the war that they left and came back to England. Hugo Breinin is very much the exception, perhaps because he married a woman who had one of the very few who survived Auschwitz and who lived in Austria.
Professor Kurt Rothschild, who was professor of economics who was in Glasgow University, went back to Vienna, to Linz, and then became economic advisor to the Austrian government. So I'm just wondering, quite a few went back to Germany. I just wondered.
Well, I should say that there has been a generational change. Since about 1990, Austria has given up the myth that it was Hitler's first victim, right? But it took 50 years for this to happen.
Can we have a question here, and then one at the back, and then we will conclude.
I also come from Vienna, and I saw the marching in myself, and I saw how the Austrians welcomed Hitler with full joy. They welcomed him, and I've never ever been back. Have you?
I have been back twice. Once after a congress in Prague, which I attended, a physiological congress, and I went to Vienna nearby by rail, and there was absolutely no attempt to memorize the Jews who lived there at all. They were quite happy to. It was ausgerottet was my term. The second time I went in order to lay one of the Stolpersteine, these memorial plaques on where Jews lived, for my parents at Lilienbrungasse, where we lived. Now,
what district was that? Welcher Bezirk war das?
Sorry.
Welcher Bezirk?
Which district? What district?
Oh, in the Triton Bezirk, just across from the Marienbrücke.
Yeah.
And to visit those graves, to visit the graves of my grandparents.
Just very quickly, I'm a history teacher, so this has been really valuable for me this evening, and I've had the opportunity to meet a couple of Holocaust survivors, and one thing that I like to ask them for going back to my classroom and speaking to my pupils about is, like, what message do you have to me as a teacher that I should be telling pupils about your experiences, so as to sort of help them in their understanding and learning about that period of history? What would be your message that I could give to, like, my second year class at the moment?
Oh dear, this is a terribly big question, isn't it? I mean,
and stuff, so.
Look, my own, this is not for your class, right? But my own feeling is, in a sense, never underestimate the cruelty and the horror which people can inflict upon each other. But this is not for your class, but that is my own feeling about it.
I have an invitation from the President, Alexander Van Bellen, to come in April. He wants to apparently apologize for the past. I read that he is the first social diplomat president of Austria since Hitler. So I have agreed to go, if I'm able, in April. Would you?
No, you had an invitation to go to Austria.
Yes.
Did you go?
I haven't been yet.
It's April.
It is for April.
It's in April.
In April.
Yes.
Look, again, these are personal things. I myself would claim to be too old now to undertake the journey. But you are a young woman.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's been, I think, for all of us, a fantastic event and very difficult event for many of those here, but I think a lecture that really has brought to life your own experience, Otto. We've had lots of people who have come to deliver the Holocaust lecture, a number of academic experts who've analysed the Holocaust from every single angle, but I think with your microhistory, with your looking at each of your individual classmates, I think you have brought the whole horror of what happened in those years much more to life, Otto, than many of the other speakers that we've had here. And can I just pick up on one or two of the points that you made, because I think they're really important and we cannot forget. And the whole purpose of these lectures is, of course, never to forget what happened during those years, because, as you pointed out at the very end, I think these sorts of events can always happen again, and we should never forget, never forget. I have to say, I think if you could have seen many of the people in the crowd when there was the reading of that poem by your classmate Kurt Matzai, I think you would have seen a huge number of people moved to tears from the words of that remarkable young man who you were in his class, and he found the words to write those verses, which are really remarkable. I think the last phrase you said in response to one of the questions, I think really struck me, because I think what the problem is often when these events happen is that there are te weinige Gerechte, too few just people. And I think as long as we have those situations, then I think we end up in these sorts of huge tragedies for humanity. So can I thank you, Otto, for your lecture? Can I thank, of course, everybody who came tonight, because I think it's been a hugely moving Holocaust lecture. And can I thank the organisers again for bringing you here today. It's been a real pleasure for us to have you back in the university. Thank you.